Hi everyone, welcome to our second lecture video for week 2. Today we will be talking about mostly about Jhumpa Lahiri's short story, A Temporary Matter, but I will also talk a little bit about the prompt and um, chapter 4, right, of Arguing About Literature, which I didn't get a chance to talk about last time. So I will just very briefly talk about chapter 4, the reading process, because that's also close reading is very important in this class and also in your essay, right? And so I wanted to make sure I talked a little bit about that. All right, so I sent you the prompt for essay 1, and if for some reason you can't find that email, you can also go to iLearn, and I've uploaded it there on in course materials, right? So so have that in front of you right now if you can, and I will just kind of quickly go through it, right? So the first essay asks you to consider either Everything That Rises Must Converge or Temporary Matter, and produce a close reading. Right. You will identify a specific issue in the story as well as pose questions regarding that issue and argue for how the issue develops the story's meaning or significance. Right. That is, you will take a position in response to your chosen issue and make a claim. Right. So I keep repeating this. You need to have an issue and then a claim for that issue. Right. As I also mentioned in the last email, right, I canceled the Sandra Cisneros reading, but if you're interested in writing about that for your response and for your essay, um, feel free to do that, right? You can do that if you want to. Okay, and it will be the same sort of standard for it. Okay, so the rest of the page sort of talks about the structure, right? So potential pitfalls to avoid, right? Mistaking summary for analysis, right? Weak papers tend to summarize as opposed to analyze, right? So obviously you'll want to summarize certain things about, about the story for context, but that should not be the focus of your essay, right? The focus should be on analysis. Cliched or obvious readings of details, right? So like I said, right, there are sort of surface readings, right? Obvious readings of the story, of the descriptions, but you want to sort of dig deeper, right, and really close read the story and look for more sort of like subtle descriptions or subtle tensions, right? That is a more interesting thing to talk about than just saying that, just saying basic things, right? Try not to be basic. Okay. So here I just sort of summarized what the structure that you should follow for this essay, right? And there are other structures, right, that you can play around with, but because we're such in a time constrained quarter like this, right? It's I think we should just stick with the basics, right? Which is the 5-paragraph formulaic essay, right? So let's just stick with that for now. Okay, so second page, again, I broke down for you on the right-hand side. I broke down for you, what the introduction should include, right? And what the body paragraphs should include, right? And then your conclusion. And on the left-hand side, there are also sort of more kind of criterias here, right? Make sure your word count is at least 1100, right? If you go a little over, maybe I would say 1400 should be your maximum, ultimate maximum. Any more than that is too much, right? You don't want to go under, but yeah, don't go too much over either, right? So outside research is not necessary for this particular essay. Um, you can read reviews or something like that about the author, about the stories, um, but you do not have to include them, right? You can just read for to give yourself more context, right? But you do not have to include them. Okay, so it's due July 8th. That's next Wednesday, right? By midnight. So, right, and so this weekend I will be a little busy, right? Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So if you want to do office hours, please email me as soon as possible, so that we can sort of sort out the time. I mean, I am busy, but I have some time in the day to spare, and so I can kind of squeeze you in. So just make sure to email me ahead of time, as soon as you can, so that we can arrange an office hour meeting, right? And then next week, Monday and Tuesday, I am free all day, right? So Monday, Tuesday, those are the 2 days before the deadline, right? Monday, even Wednesday, right? I'm also available next week. So yeah, we can also meet then if you want, right? So just email me if you need help about anything, right? All right, so that's for the prompts. If you have more questions, feel free to email me about them. Okay, so we are going to jump right in to the reading process, which is chapter 4 of your Arguing About Literature book. All right, so this entire chapter, right, I encourage you to read, you're supposed to be reading it already, right, because that's on the syllabus. But, if there is one chapter that you should actually read in its entirety, I think it should be chapter 4, right? Because that is the chapter about close reading, which is, the focus of this class, right? Okay, so close reading, right? Just like what the name is sort of represents, right? Is that it's you're reading something closely, right? As opposed to just what's on the surface. You're kind of digging deeper, right, into a deeper meaning of things, right? And so it's a deep analysis of something, right? And this will come in handy, right? Whatever your major is, right? You will eventually be asked to to read something and then analyze it, right? And then make connections, point out patterns, right? And so that's why we teach close reading in these composition classes, because we think that that sort of it does not only prepare you, right, to know how to read and write and summarize, right, but it also practices you, right, to analyze and be critical, right, and sort of perform critical thinking, right. Okay, so on page 82, right, you have the strategies here for close reading. And there are 8 strategies here. I'm not going to go through all of them. But yeah, they're pretty self-explanatory when you read them. Make predictions as you read, right? I think some of you are already doing this. And really, every time I talk about the literature in this class, right? When I, in my last video about, or 2 videos ago, right, about everything that rises, right? What I was doing in that video is close reading, right? I was mentioning patterns, I was mentioning the style, I was mentioning characters, and making connections, right? I was mentioning symbolisms, I was interpreting things, and maybe you'll disagree with some of my interpretations. It's perfectly fine. That's how interpretation works. But yeah, what I'm doing here, what I'm going to do in this video, right, talking about a temporary matter, that is close reading, right? So just pay attention to how I am interpreting these stories, and you don't have to imitate my readings, right? My interpretations, but you can imitate the way that I close read, right? How I look at the last sentence, the first sentence, the first paragraph, but you can interpret it your own way. But yeah, you can follow along with how I interpret them, right? Okay, and then page 85, there are also kind of guidelines to how you might be able to make notes, right? As you go, right? Like I mentioned also before, make sure you're making notes. And then on page 93, right? I'll show you a little bit here. Right, so that's page 93, and notice how, this is quite organized, right? Because it's done kind of digitally. But, if you look at my notes, this is also how they look like, right? Like I underline things, I circle things, and then there's like notes on the margins, there's like arrows, and there's like, things are being connected, right? It's so much messier than this. But this is how sort of good note-taking, I think, should look like. People work differently, but yeah, this works for me, because then it's not even like a matter of going back and making sense of it, right? Because sometimes that doesn't even make sense anymore, right? You can probably go back and then remember some things, but the idea of note taking, right? I think the more important part is the actual act of writing notes, right? That process of writing notes on the margins and underlining things, that actually sort of imprints the notes into your head also, as well as on the paper, right? So that process itself familiarizes you with what you're reading, right? So I think note taking is very important. All right, let's jump right into the story, A Temporary Matter by Jhumpa Lahiri. Right. So to start, Jhumpa Lahiri is an American author, right? She's known for her short stories. She has 2 collections of short stories. Interpretive Maladies is the first one, published in 1999, and it won her a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, right? And Pulitzer Prize is probably like the most prestigious, right, literary prize in America. There are other bigger ones out there. The Booker Prize or the Man Booker Prize, is kind of like the Pulitzer version of the United Kingdom, right? And then there's also the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, right, which is probably the biggest one. So the Pulitzer is kind of the biggest sort of American prize for fiction. And then, right, so that's Interpretive Maladies, right? Interpretive Maladies, or A Temporary Story, is one of the stories in Interpretive Maladies, right? So Interpretive Maladies is a collection of short stories. And then Another collection of short stories is Unaccustomed Earth, right? And then her first novel is The Namesake, right? And then her other novel is The Lowland, also, right? Which was it did not win, but it was nominated for a Man Booker Prize in the United Kingdom. And then more recently, I think this was published 2 or 3 years ago, is a memoir, right, called In Other Words. And she actually published this in Italian, right? Because she's brilliant, and um, she actually, I think she has a PhD in Renaissance art or Renaissance studies or something like that, and she's interested in Italian language, and she also, very interested in Italy. All right, and so a few years ago, she decided that she wanted to, she already spoke some Italian, but then she wanted to be fluent in Italian, and she wanted to actually write in Italian, and so she moved her family to Italy for a few years to really engage with the culture and be fluent in Italian, right? And then the product of that was her memoir, In Other Words, which she wrote in Italian. I've read it; it's beautiful, but I've read obviously the English translation. Right? She did not translate it herself. She had someone else translate it for her. But yeah, I've read the English translation. So yeah, she's an amazing writer. I think I've read most of the things that she's written, and I love every single one of them. Right. And on the surface, you might think of A Temporary Matter as kind of boring, right? It doesn't have kind of big tragedies, or I mean, there is like a little bit of a tragedy, right? Like the their child being born sort of dead, right? That is very tragic in itself, right? But that was also just a very small part um, of the story, right? It didn't really sort of determine. Maybe it did, but yeah, but for the most part, the focus of the story, right, is just kind of like the everyday life, right? And just cooking and eating and going in and out of the house from work, right? And being bored, right? And going to the grocery store, right? So like all of these kind of like everyday things that people do, right? That's I think she's known for using that sort of as her sort of subject in her stories, right? So she takes just everyday regular people and kind of make their life interesting on the page, I think, right? Through her descriptions, right? And yeah, and so a lot of her stories, they sort of they tackle death, separation, um, marriage separation, but also separation from family, separation from country, right? And that's usually kind of like the overarching background of her story, right? But then most of her story sort of focuses on the effects of that sort of like big event, right? The effect of death, right? And like how does that sort of how do the characters cope with that, right? How do they how do these tragic events sort of um, slowly eat them up, right? But also, how do they sort of make peace, right? Or kind of evolve, right, as people because of this tragic events, right? And so, for me personally, right, what's interesting to me in storytelling, right, and people have different tastes depending on what how you've been trained to read, right? Or what kinds of um, stories you're used to reading, right? And for me, it's mostly kind of like realist stories, right? Stories of everyday life. That's the kind of story that really interests me. Um, and and I think because these stories are relatable, right? And you can sort of easily put yourself in it, and um, not because you have the same story, but you sort of like you recognize yourself in a specific action, right? Or you try to make sense of your own story, right? Of your own experience based on other people's experience, right? So I think that's why sort of I'm drawn, and a lot of people are drawn to these kinds of writing, right? And so, as you probably noticed, right, Lahiri is very well known for her precise kind of surgical, some reviewer, a reviewer from the New York Times, I think, has described her writing as surgically precise, right? Like her sentences, her dialogues, her descriptions, right, are surgically, quote unquote, surgically precise, right? Um, and and yeah, and I think it's true, right? She has a very, and that's why you also notice with her characters, and um, Shukumar is a um, isn't he like a science or a math um, graduate student, right? But um, he's very mathematical and methodical, right? Shukumar, while Shobha is more sort of more creative, more um, likes poetry, right, and stuff like that. And so there is this tension in the two people um, who's precise, and then the other that's more sort of spontaneous, I guess, right? Um, and so those two things are also, um, I think, a big part of her style of writing, right? On the one hand, her sentences are very precise and very well put together, almost sort of mathematical, right? But the way she describes things is also very abstract, right? Or I guess unclear or uncertain, right? And so you also get that tension that even though she says things or she writes things sort of strict or methodically, right? It's still hard to or it's still not easy, right? To kind of to make sense of her stories, right? And what is she trying to do, right? It's not easy to decipher what she means, right? So those two things are also there. All right, so let's start with a quote, a long quote from page 2, right? So this is page 2. Let's see. Page 2, that's the first paragraph on page 2, right? So a member of the staff had found him somehow among the identical convention rooms and handed him a stiff square of stationery, right? So this is when Shubhash is actually, good God, he's the character from um, Lahiri's novel, The Lowland, right? So Shubhash is the character, so I got the two mixed. Um, right, Shukumar, right? So Shobha was pregnant at this time, right? And Shukumar was not going to go to the convention because um, because he didn't want to miss Shoba's delivery, right? But then Shoba decided that, or insisted that he goes to the convention and that she will take care of herself. So sure enough, Shoba sort of um, had to deliver her baby when Shokumar was out of town, and then Shokumar was then contacted that this had happened. Right. So a member of the staff had found him somehow among the identical convention rooms and handed him a stiff square of stationery. Right. It was only a telephone number, but Shokumar knew it was the hospital. Right. When he returned to Boston, it was over. The baby had been born dead. Right. Shoba was lying on a bed, asleep in a private room so small there was barely enough space to stand beside her, in a wing of the hospital they hadn't been to on the tour for expectant parents. Her placenta had weakened, and she'd had a cesarean, though not quickly enough. The doctor explained that these things happen. He smiled in the kindest way it was possible to smile at people known only professionally. Shoba would be back on her feet in a few weeks. There was nothing to indicate that she would not be able to have children in the future. Right. So again, there's a lot going on here, right? And notice too the kind of in this like short paragraph, right? The time span is very long, right? And so she's Shukumar starts in Boston, right? And then he gets a notice that Shoba um, was delivering her baby, and so he goes back to Boston, right? And then he goes to the hospital, right? And then he finds out that the baby was dead, right? So yeah, so like that sort of like description, and she makes it seem here, right? So like there's so much time that it covers, but like the flow of the sentence like makes it seem like it's natural, right? Like it's not awkward, right? That so much time had passed, um, and so yeah, so that's also um, part of her good descriptions, right? And then notice how she just kind of like inserted, right, the death of the baby, right. When he returned to Boston, it was over, right. The baby had been born dead. So there's no sort of, I don't know about you, but like the first time I read this, like there was no indication. Um, Although like my sick mind already kind of I thought about it. Um, but like there's no indication in her writing, right, that this would lead to the baby dying, right. So like everything seems to be like working as planned, right. So it's very strategic, and then he did this, he goes to Boston, and then he goes to the hospital, but then things did not go as planned, right. The baby was dead. So just inserting that kind of that crucial scene right in the middle of that page, I think really kind of gave it like a subtle tragic feel to it, right. And then Shoba was lying in bed, asleep in a private room so small there was barely enough space to stand beside her, right. In a wing of the hospital they hadn't been to on the tour for expectant parents, right. And so that also that in a wing of the hospital they hadn't been to on the tour for expectant parents, right. So you know, presumably they went to the hospital and then they gave them the tour of where to go and like what part of the maternity ward they were going to be at, right. But it was not part of the tour to send people to this room where you know uh, people whose children have died would have to go to, right. So that's not part of the kind of the tour, and so that give it that description, right. It's a very subtle description, but I think it gives it a kind of it makes it kind of emotional, right. um, and that kind of like subtle emotion is also you know what I like her for. Um, and then the doctor explained that these things happen, right? He smiled in the kindest way it was possible to smile people known only professionally, right? So that's also another subtle description, right? But it's this kind of like awkward, and she's good at describing like awkward moments, right? And describing that kind of like smile that doctors they want to be sympathetic, but uh, bottom line is patients are there's always that line between doctors and patients, right? Um, and they often kind of like make that a non-emotional sort of like line, right? And so yeah, so her pointing out that smile, right? That professional smile, I thought was kind of like very important. Right. And then let's move on to page 3. So page 3, and so they're in bed, right? And then they have this like little ritual that they do in bed before going to bed, right? And so this is towards the end of page 3, going into page 4, right? So at some point in the evening, she visited him. Right? When he heard her approach, he would put away his novel and begin typing sentences, right? And so that kind of like very subtle part, right? Where because like he's reading a novel, I guess, for fun, but then once he starts hearing that Ashoba was coming to his room, because they had been working in different rooms of the house, right? Because he's writing his dissertation, and so he needs that silence. And then when he hears Ashoba coming in, right, he throws away the novel and then starts typing to act like he's being productive, and his he's doing his job, right? He's researching. Um, and so she would rest her hands on his shoulders and stare with him into the blue glow of the computer screen. "Don't work too hard," she would say after a minute or two, and head off to bed. It was the one time in the day she sought him out, and yet he'd come to dread it. He knew it was something she forced herself to do. Right. So, like on the surface, this, before the last sentence, right, it sounds very kind of like romantic, right? Very gentle, very tender, very romantic scene, right? Where she would go to visit him, and then she kind of like hides his novel to kind of act like he's writing, right? And then they will kind of like touch each other, right? And then she would say, "Don't work too hard," right? So it's very tender, very romantic scene, but then she inserts that last sentence, right? He knew it was something she forced herself to do, right? So that kind of like gave it that kind of like tragic, almost, right, tinge to the relationships, right? So there is a sense that there's something going wrong, right, with the two, and they're both aware of it, but they're not telling each other about it. They kind of like start to develop, being annoyed with each other or something, right? Something had changed and something is sort of drifting them apart, right? But they don't know yet what caused it, right? And so, for this specific story, the issue of cause and effect, right, I think is a good sort of way to read the story, right? If you think about what happened towards the end, and how they're going to separate, right, and then you kind of like, so that's like the effect, right, but then you want to kind of like go back and um, trace, right, like what happened, right, and what happened within the relationship, not just yeah, it's kind of obvious that the dead baby was a major source of um, the disconnect, right, between the couple. But obviously there's something more, I think, in their relationship that's the reason why they ended up like this, right? Not just the baby, because, you know, like a good marriage is supposed to withstand, like and I don't know what a good marriage is, but if the relationship is strong, right, it should be able to um, to to kind of like withstand, something tragic like that, right? And if anything, that kind of tragedy would even draw people together, right? But then somehow that was kind of like the needed thing to break them apart, right? It seemed like there was already some kind of tension and issue, and they're already kind of drifting, right? And then that sort of like the dead baby just kind of, you know, made that clearer for them, right? So you want to kind of go back and trace that, right? Like what, other than the dead baby, what else about the relationship sort of led to them separating, led to Shoba, kind of deciding to like not go on with the relationship, right? Okay, and so again, another biographical information about Jhumpa Lahiri is that her parents are from West Bengal in India, right? And they moved to London for work. Um, and Jhumpa Lahiri was then born in London while they were there, right? And then they moved to America when Jhumpa Lahiri was 3 years old, right? So um, for the most part, right, she considers herself just American, right? And another aspect of her sort of the particularity of her immigrant experience, right? And this is something that she's addressed in an interview, right? Is that her family was already sort of well off in India, and then they moved to London for work, and they did not have to because they were already doing well, but then it was a decision that they wanted to do, right? And then they came to America for work. The parents came to America for work, right? They did not have to, but it was a decision that they made. Right. So their immigrant experience is not one of sort of desperation or wanting to move to another country because life was so hard in back in their country, or because of a genocide or a dictator or whatever, right? It was a sort of it was more of a choice, right, to move, um, to immigrate, right? And so that's a very specific kind of immigrant experience, right? Um, and yeah, so um, but they also growing up, right? Her mother always took her children back to Kolkata to visit, right? Because her mother wanted them to have that sort of relationship with their Indian heritage, right? Um, and so that going back and forth, right? That sort of like tug between two countries, two cultures, right, are very much a part of Jhumpa Lahiri's stories, right? And speaking of, let's look at Shukumar's kind of like tug between his sort of American and Indian identities, right? Let's go to page 4. So that's kind of slightly above the middle of page 4, right? Shukumar returned to the kitchen and began to open drawers. He tried to locate a candle among the scissors, the egg beaters and whisks, the mortar and pestle she'd bought in a bazaar in Calcutta, and used to pound garlic cloves and cardamom pods back when she used to cook. He found a flashlight, but no batteries, and a half-empty box of birthday candles. Shoba had thrown him a surprise birthday party last May. 120 people had crammed into the house. All the friends and the friends of friends they now systematically avoided. Bottles of Vino Verde had nested in a bed of ice in the bathtub. Shoba was in her 5th month, drinking ginger ale from a martini glass. She had made a vanilla cream cake with custard and spun sugar. All night she kept Shukumar's long fingers linked with hers as they walked among the guests at the party. Right. So, this kind of like simple act of so Shukumar was in the kitchen, right? He was cooking lamb that night, and he was looking for candles because the temporary matter is that for a couple of nights electricity will be out because there was some kind of renovation or reconstruction being done in the neighborhood, right? And so they would be out of electricity for a couple of nights, right? And so he was in the kitchen trying to finish cooking before it gets dark, and he was looking for candles and flashlights, right? And then he sort of, as he was doing that, right, he saw a mortar and pestle that he bought in Calcutta, right? And that mortar and pestle he uses to pound garlic cloves and cardamom pods, right? Um, right, and then how that kind of like, and notice, right? So this is this is what you do, right, when you're close reading, is that you're noticing like every single detail, right? The choice to describe the egg beaters and whisks, right? That's a very American thing. Like that's a very like egg beaters, right? Which is like a whisk specifically for eggs, right? It's like something that you can buy in a American kind of like TV shopping or something, right? Um, right. So like egg beaters in the same kind of like cupboard, right, as the mortar and pestle, right? So all these kind of like American products, like sort of next to um, the mortar and pestle that he got from Calcutta, right? So that description, right, is not just there for no reason, right? That's there to kind of like really reinforce, right, this idea of like the two cultures sort of mixing, right? Um, yeah, and then notice too how Shoba was in her 5th month drinking ginger ale from a martini glass, right? She had made vanilla cream cake, so there's something with custard and spun sugar, right? So that's also like a very kind of drinking vino verde, right? That sounds to me like a very sort of hipster or type of a party, right? Something that you can see being held in like a gentrified neighborhood in LA or something like that, right? So there's something very American in that, but also kind of like juxtaposed, right, um, with kind of like their Indian heritage, right? But also notice that Shukumar and Shoba have kind of like slightly, they have very different immigrant experiences, right? Shukumar came to America at a very young age, right? Just like Jhumpa right? And so he's very Americanized in that way, and he didn't really go back a lot. Like he went back to Kolkata a couple of times, right, as implied here, but not a lot because his dad got worried that he would get some kind of food poisoning or water, I don't know, polluted water or something. So his dad was worried about that, and so he just never took Shukumar back to India as much. Um, but Shoba came to America sort of at a later age. I forget. I think she was already in college, right, when she came to America, And so Shobha has a more sort of um, a closer connection to India, but at the same time, she also um, she still finds, it seems, right, she still finds some kind of novelty, right, in the American culture, right, and so she's still sort of testing things out, and enjoying, right, the American life. But and I think that cultural backdrop, right, is very important to think about, because in many ways, that kind of that cultural backdrop sort of defines some of their desires, right, and why they want sort of, that kind of like a traditional family, have children, have a well-kept house. Um, the woman sort of stays at home and, be domestic, right, and stuff like that. Um, so there is that sort of like aspect of their lives, right? But then when that didn't work out, right, because um, the child is dead, right? That that kind of created a way out, if you will, right? That kind of like created a sort of, a rupture, a disruption, right, to sort of the traditional way that things were supposed to be, right? So you can look at that as a good or bad thing, right? Maybe it was like a needed thing, like it was a thing that they needed to sort of like realize that this was not working out, right? Um, so yeah, and so that sort of backdrop also tells us what Shokumar's priorities are, right? And also Shoba's priorities, right? It seems like Shoba um, still wants to explore other things, right? Shokumar seems, he's done with, he seems settled. He seems like ready to sort of uh, be in like a settled relationship and family type dynamic, right? But then Shoba is still sort of um, being more experimental and, doing things. And so yeah, and so that sort of like that that cultural backdrop, right? You can also read that as sort of determining why they acted the way that they did, right? All right, let's jump into page 10, right? So this is after Shoba sort of told Shukumar um, that she had already decided to leave him, right? And it's not clear if it's like temporary or permanent, right? The separation, but she just has decided that she wants to move out and find and have her own apartment and and do that. And then this is when she broke the that news, right, to Shukumar. Right. So this is the middle of page 10. Right. She wouldn't look at him, but he stared at her. It was obvious that she'd rehearsed the lines. Right. All this time, she'd been looking for an apartment, testing the water pressure, asking a realtor if heat and hot water were included in the rent. It sickened Shukumar, knowing that she had spent these past evenings preparing for a life without him. He was relieved, and yet he was sickened. This was what she'd been trying to tell him for the past 4 evenings. This was the point of her game. Right. This is a good description, right, of that feeling when you realize that you've been betrayed or lied to, right? Even if it's like not intentionally against you, but you just realize, oh shit, right? Like this person is not. who I thought this person was. Yeah, and so that kind of like mixed emotions, right, was also there, right. Also, I wanted to mention, so what Shobha does for a living, right? Um, let me find it. That's on page 2, right? Um, so she worked in an office in downtown where she searched, this is the middle of page 2, where she searched for typographical errors in textbooks and marked them, right? So her job is this thing. She's kind of like an editor, right? But like the actual kind of um, person who actually edits, right, books, right, where they look for um, errors, right, syntactical errors to make sure that before it's published, the books are published, every sentence is perfect, right. And there are sometimes there some mistakes still make it through publication, but that's their job, right, is to make sure that all the sentences are clean, right. And so that job is also not coincidental, right? So her job is pretty much to make everything perfect, right? That seems to be what she does, what she did at home, right? Remember when the story went back to what she, her job, right? She's very organized. She would have like this, mason jars of chutneys and all sorts of pickles, right? That she would do herself. Um, and then she had this little baggies of meat, all kind of like stacked up in the freezer. She's a very organized person, and she's very kind of strategic, methodical, um, and right, and that job too, right, is sort of is, and that's probably why she liked that job, because her job is to like organize everything and make sure everything is perfect, right. Um, And so that kind of like tension, right? That everything that she did in her life and everything that she does with her job is to make everything perfect and methodical. And yet her desires, right, to like go out and like have a drink with a friend, like have a martini, right, or just decide to leave her husband, right, and start looking for a house, right, and tell her husband that she had been looking for a house to move out to on the day that she got the house, right. So there is a very stark difference between the two, right, and that's another cause and effect thing that you can sort of think about if you want. Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. And then let's just jump right into the last sentence, right? So after everything, right? They've told each other everything. There was nothing left to tell, right? So they've been honest, right? So the last sentence is they wept together, right? For the things they now knew, right? I think that's my favorite sentence in this story. So there's no satisfaction, right? There's no kind of like real ending, but the act of sort of like weeping together, right? That's a very intimate act, right? Almost as intimate as having sex, right? If not more so, right? Weeping together as sort of lovers or ex-lovers, right? That's a very intimate act, I think. And so I think that makes that scene, that ending scene, very, very tender, right? Whether they realize something or not, I don't know. But ending it with that very intimate scene is a very sort of, I think, a very humane, right, way to end the story. Right, and this idea of knowing, right? They wept together for the things they now knew, right? So there is a sense that in the beginning, they were hiding things from each other, right? But then because of those couple of nights where the lights were out, right, they were forced to talk, and they were forced to tell each other things, right, and to be honest to each other. but then somehow knowing about each other, I don't like it. It seems like it it did something, but also like knowing is. I guess my point is that knowing something was not a consolation. It did not make things better, right? Knowing sort of, yeah, it did not, like, usually what they say, right, like truth prevails, and like truth will set you free, right? That's the common cliche, right? um, but here it seems like knowing did not really make things better for them, did not make them sort of did not make the situation better, right? It only made them maybe sort of know. It was just knowing, right? But I don't know. Maybe you have a different idea, right? So let's think about that. What that ending means, right? Yeah. So I look forward to your response to this reading, and I hope you liked it as much as I did. Yeah. So that's it for today, and email me if you have any questions.